Again, it will only record the video of the person who is talking. So if you would like to talk and don't want to have your video on the screen, you may turn off your video. So we're going to do an overview of Unit 6. We'll take a quick peek at the unit outline first and let you know about the Patterns Biology website. The website is going to be undergoing an overhaul, and I don't know if we have a time frame on that yet, but just FYI that that's coming. We are going to work through our Unit 6. We'll talk about each task set, and there are a total of 5 task sets in this unit. But as you see here in the agenda, we'll be able to look a little bit more deeply at actually 3 of those 5 in a pretty deep way today. So we will be looking specifically at some of the design ideas behind the patterns courses, which we call the design principles, and how they apply in certain task sets in this unit. Now, we'll do a quick idea at norms. If you're not speaking, we would love you to be muted, but we welcome your questions, and we would love to hear you to pose those questions out loud if you prefer. Certainly, if you have an imminent question about a topic at hand, you can always put it in the chat, but you are also welcome to put sort of longer term questions, which could be outside of the range for this webinar. You can put those into the parking lot of the Jamboard, which I just put into the chat. Okay. So it would be helpful for you to have this link open. Jason has put it into the chat a couple of times. The bit.ly will allow you to click on links. So this unit was developed during distance learning. And so it's been, and a lot of people, to be honest, the feedback that we get is that a lot of people don't get to Unit 6. So as far as I know, although I would love to hear from you, I know I have taught it twice, once in hybrid in 2021, and then once last year in person. And I will teach it, my team at Mountainside will teach it this year in person. But I don't know if anybody else has taught this unit. So if you have, I would love to know. We do have a couple of other schools in Beaverton where they have gotten to it in one year or the other, and the feedback has been positive, but we would love to hear any of your feedback. Okay, cool, Erica, thank you. Thanks for that. So it's being taught in the Coast in North Bend. And so it is on the shorter side, but you need to, just because we have not had on the council, I might be the only person on the council who has taught this unit. So there has not been a lot of iteration, because to be frank, it works relatively well for what for my purposes. And we haven't had a lot of constructive feedback. So if you have constructive feedback, we always want to hear that. We're working as a council on how we collect feedback. That's going to be part of what the new website will have, a mechanism for collecting feedback, preferably constructive feedback. That's always nice for the council to have something to work with so that we know what teachers are looking for. But the council members all are working in schools. We all are teaching our own classes. Also, it's a thing that we do on the side to work through and iterate the curriculum. So like I said, our topic today is matter, energy, and climate change. And the question that students are trying to answer by the end of this unit is, how does the changing climate affect or impact Earth's ecosystems and the cycling of carbon? And we look at this through, of course, the idea or the phenomenon of climate change altering our ecosystems, including the forests of the Northwest. And specifically, as you will see, we look at this through the lens of wildfire. And that is, of course, because in 2020, 2021, when this unit was being developed, we all, if you're living in the Portland area or anywhere, frankly, in Oregon or Northern California at that time, we had some really awful wildfire that year or that fall. And then that continued into last fall also with, frankly, I think it's probably very likely that we'll have similar situations moving forward every fall. So if you haven't yet, take a look and click on that Unit 6 outline. I'm going to just bring it up here on my screen. And just want to let you know, just as a kind of a check-in, that if you have been looking at unit outlines and they do not, and if the unit outlines that you're familiar with do not have this message on the top, then you are looking at old unit outlines. So I tried to put that message on all the new ones and a similar message on all the old ones that say, hey, you're looking at something that's not up to date. You should click on this other link to get to the new one. So just be aware of that. Unit outline looks very similar. If you're familiar with the other, the way that the others look, they're all set up the same. We have the NGSS performance expectations, which we will be going over today. Some identification of what kinds of the practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas that are covered in this unit. And then coming down through the different task sets, with some estimates about time. Sometimes those are hard to do depending on if you're on a block schedule or not. And, depends a lot on your classroom, right? So we try to get those estimates plus or minus, I don't know, 25%, I'd say. And so what we are going to do today, I'm probably not going to come back through this document anymore because the relevant links that we will be using today are in our slideshow. But this is a good document for you to have bookmarked during a unit, for you to be able to find, sort of see the overall scope of the unit. One thing that the Biology Council has on tap or on our to-do list to start during the summer and to use through next year is to write sort of unit level pedagogical arc type of documents. I know that they're working on those in the Chemistry Council right now. That has not been in our, it's high on the priority list, but not the highest items on the priority list. So we have not gotten to that this year, but it is something that we're looking to do to kind of be in line with what they're doing in the other councils. So this document provides a lot of information, some guidance. Some of this will go away, will be part of that unit arc in the next iteration of this type of document. But just wanted to give you a quick overview of what that document contains so that you can refer to it later on your own. This is not going to be something we will look at in any more detail today, because the things that we're going to check out have all of their links in our slideshow. When you try to access the pattern share drive, you get an automated message from your administrator.
Yeah, it's not me. I'm kind of passing it along just so that you know.
So I would say that if you're having trouble with a shared drive, that might be that your shared drive setup is locked. So let me show you what I would do. You go to drive.google.com. I'm sorry, I'm just going to expand my view here so you can see a little bit better. So over on the left-hand side, I'm going to click on shared drives. And if you're the person who sent this message and you can't see that, then we may need to talk separately. But in shared drives, over here on the right, once you have shared drives selected, on the right-hand side, there's this button that says hidden shared drives. And I don't have any that are hidden, but it's possible that our shared drives are hidden for you. So that's the one thing that I can think of right now that could be the cause of your issue. But if that does not turn out to be the case, then we'll have to try to do some other troubleshooting later. Let me go back to my thing here, so I'm sharing my correct stuff. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So I mentioned at the top that we'll be taking a look at some of the design principles today. There are 8 design principles, and you have links there to the descriptions of them. We're going to be taking a look at the 3 that are highlighted over the course of the day today, or our webinar time. Now, we all know as biology teachers that there are so many performance expectations in the life sciences strands. We have 29 performance expectations if you include the earth and space science ones that are relevant to biology. I don't know about all districts, but in my district, we do not teach an earth science course at the high school level, and none of the, as far as I know, I don't know, Doug, Jeff, maybe you guys could help me have a little bit more longevity in the district than I do, but I don't think that there's a earth science course taught in any high schools in Beaverton. So what the strategy has been in our district is to divide the earth science, the ESS standards among the 3 patterns courses, and each subject area takes on the ESS ones that are relevant to that, that are most relevant to that subject area. So we take on a fair number in biology. And you can see on this list that the 4 at the bottom, I mean, it almost doubles the list of the performance expectations for this unit. Half of them are in the life science strand and half of them are in the earth and space science strand. So you'll see as we go through each task, which targets are being assessed. Yeah, that's a good point. We do have, right, there's in environmental science, or in the IB schools, we teach a class called environmental systems and societies, I think. But since not all students take those courses, those environmental science types of courses, the performance expectations, since they're tested, they have to be divided among the classes that all of the students are taking. All right, so let's jump right in. So I've linked the unit outline at the top of every slide here so that you have access to it, but you may not need to look at it every time. We're going to take a look at individual components of our unit here. So we start most units in patterns biology with some sort of questioning type of technique. And the one I like the most, which is the one I use the most, is the one where we provide students with a lot of different things to observe, a lot of different phenomena to look at, and to encourage them to write questions that they are wondering about when they are presented with information. So you can see that this particular picture here it's a graph that comes from the New York Times that shows that 2020 was the most active fire year on the West Coast, and not just by a little bit, right? By a lot. So this is just one example of one piece of information that we provide to students in this introductory activity. And in my classroom, I have students track all of this in the interactive notebook, and I'm going to just pull the link for the INB here. Different teachers do this in different ways. This is the interactive notebook version that is in the patterns folders right now, and it gives students all places to write down everything that they might need for this unit. If you're following the patterns curriculum pretty closely, you might not need to make a lot of changes to this if you're providing it to students. We do have some teachers who have converted this into slides. I've kind of stuck with the doc format, had some technical difficulties with slides once, and so just kind of have stuck to the docs version. But what you see here in this example, or in this section of the INB, is that the students have a thumbnail picture or a picture of the thing that I show on the slides, and then they have either 1 or 2 questions that they are answering about that particular image. So like this one, for example, with the picture of California and Oregon and Washington, that image is not there for the purposes of them analyzing that image, because it's obviously much too small, but they're able to see that on the big screen in the classroom and to have some conversation with their table group. So there are talk protocols associated with this type of activity, and it's a great one for just eliciting student questions about the topic and about the phenomenon. So here's another example. Sometimes they're animations. This is an animation that shows changes in climate or changes in global temperature. We have temperature anomalies. We have, data about bird migration, the fact that birds are migrating to higher latitudes than they were 20 years ago, right? So you see just in this animation, just some examples of the data that we're showing to students in their INB or in this task. And one thing that they do at the end of this task is that they work with their table group to decide, of the questions that they've generated, which ones do they think are the most important, that they really would love to have answered. And for a long time, I did this with sticky notes. They wrote their questions on the sticky notes, and then they would present those, and then they presented those questions, and we categorized them and put the sticky notes onto whiteboards. Now I do all of that with Jamboard, so that earlier on I was identifying what kinds of things I do with Jamboard. This is one of the things I do. It's a lot easier to keep those questions. We can come back to them, take a look at them from time to time to say, hey, did what questions have we answered in class today? And we don't, of course, get to all the questions. One of the challenging things about soliciting questions from students is that we as teachers know where the unit is going, and the questions that students ask don't always go in the direction that we know the unit has to go. So we don't always get to all the questions. And sometimes sort of as we're wrapping up, we try to go back and hit the ones that haven't been covered. Any questions about this introductory engagement activity before we move on? Feel free to unmute if you have a question, or you can put it in the chat. Okay. So as I mentioned before, there are a fair number of earth science standards that are addressed in this unit. We hit them alongside the life science standards. And in some cases, I kind of wonder why they're set as separate standards. LS25 and ESS 26 are actually really very similar to each other, both having to do with the cycling of carbon. One of them says develop a model. The other one says develop a quantitative model. So those seem to be very similar to me, but there must have been, I think that the people who wrote them must have had a reason, but we throw these two together because they are pretty similar. And as we explore the carbon cycle, we're taking a look at how students take a look at, it's an older simulator that comes from Annenberg, but I have yet to find anything that works as well. So I would like you, please, if you could, to click on the link here for the carbon cycle simulation. I'm going to copy the link and put it in the chat in case you don't happen to have the slides. Just take a minute to make sure that you can see that. You should be able to have it view only. If you prefer to have your own copy and make notes, you're welcome to do that. And we're going to take a few minutes to look through and see what is it that students are doing in this task. So I'm going to go ahead and have the simulation activity open here. And instead of going through the whole student document, I'm just going to click on this Carbon Lab simulator. I'm going to give you guys a link to that also. And I'm going to click on that and open that up. This is from Annenberg. And like I said, I really wish that we could get an update. It would be awesome if we could get an update, because I think that this thing really, although it looks kind of old and clunky, it does a really great job at getting the ideas across that we need to get across. So just play around with this a little bit. I'll have you do what I have students do. You can run these simulations. So there's several parameters. You have parameters around fossil fuel usage, increasing by 4% annually, all the way down to decreasing by 4% annually. And then net deforestation from plus to minus 4 gigatons annually. And there's these sliders, that they can use to identify the level of their deforestation. You can also use your arrow keys and type. So if I put in 3.8 here, that works. And then you click on what you have down below is the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide in parts per million from 1850 or so to 2100. And it also marks the goal limit at 550 parts per million. So that is, for a long time was the value that we that was set by international climate experts to the value that we did not want to exceed, kind of like the point of no return. They've since revised that to actually be lower. So that goal limit is actually lower than 550 parts per million. And so then so you'll see that it starts here at 2010. And if you run decade by decade, right, it gives predictions about what would actually happen if the fossil fuel use in this case was increasing by 2% per year and we deforested 3.8 gigatons annually. And then they're allowed to see that, we're able to see that by whatever that is, 2055 or so, that we would have surpassed that goal limit, right? But you may have also noticed that while I was doing that and clicking on run decade, carbon was moving around on the right-hand side. So like I said, it is a little bit clunky, and it's like each one of these little boxes has a value. Each one is, I can't remember how much it is. It says it in the student doc. Each one of those boxes, it says it down at the bottom. Oh, you might not be able to see that on my screen. Each one of those boxes represents 25 gigatons of carbon. And then it also gives us a value here in the smokestack of what the atmospheric carbon is being released. And over here, we have the total atmospheric carbon at 1,042 parts per million, which is the last point on the graph. So whatever the last point on the graph is actually shown over here in the atmosphere. Now you can reset it, right? It goes back to where it was. This is for 2010, so it was 390 or so parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so we have students just kind of move around these things and see, well, okay, well, if we change our fossil fuel usage by 1% per year, what's that going to do according to this model? What's that going to do to our atmospheric CO2? And they can see that it seems to flatten out, because that would, and we all know that if we continue to reduce our continue to reduce our fossil fuel usage, then it's actually getting lower and lower each year. And so that's why we're starting to see a flattening of that curve, because of course that would be simultaneous with population growth. And so, yeah, so currently, Jason just looked it up, it's currently about 419 parts per million. So we're about here or so. My model would predict or predicted 419 for 2020 if we had reduced our fossil fuel usage. So we know that this model is flawed in some ways, but the numbers, in my mind, the numbers, other than maybe that goal limit, are less important than the trend, right? And what we want students to see is that even if we were to keep fossil fuel usage at 0 increase, let me reset actually, and then run the decades, we would still at some point hit the goal limit, right? Much further out than the reality, at least what the trend is currently. But it also allows them to see that if we continue to increase fossil fuel usage, I won't bother necessarily to even reset it, but if we run those decades, right, eventually all the coal and gas goes away. Right. So this is also an exercise where they get to identify where are the sources and sinks of carbon in Earth's systems. So at some point, all the oil and gas and coal, the fossil fuels are gone. And only at that point do we see this in, this change point in the and atmospheric CO2 then starts to drop. And you can continue on with that trend. But we never get those fossil fuels back. So the task prompts students to do a variety of different things. Figure out where the sources and sinks are, figure out what the largest ones are, play around with the simulator. What happens when you increase fossil fuel usage, or what happens when you decrease deforestation? And the goal, several goals in mind, but in my mind, the biggest one is that they realize that it doesn't matter how much deforestation we stop doing, like how much we reforest. In this model, it doesn't matter if you reforest at the maximum level. If you don't change the fossil fuel usage, we will hit the goal limit relatively soon. We never stay under that orange line. So there's a reminder about greenhouse gases. There's a reference here. We've had this task in the curriculum for a while in different spots, but we added some information about the Paris Climate Agreement. Here's that data. The goal limit of 550 parts per million represents a temperature increase of 3 degrees C. But we know that would actually cause such bad extreme weather and sea level rise that global food supply would be endangered. So we need to keep that number below, certainly well below 3C. And I think they're now talking like 1.5, and we're already at 1. So they do some predictions. They do some playing around with the simulator. They see where they make some, they see where the graph goes under certain scenarios and try to identify what is required for us to stay under the goal limit. Okay. So like I said, it's an older simulation, but I like it, and I have not been able to find anything that does this type of modeling on anything that's newer. So if you know something, I would love to hear about it.
Do you have keys for these? I'm just wondering, it's when we've never done it before, it's always nice if there's some kind of a key to look at to make sure we're understanding it, I guess.
If we have it secret, it's there in the folder. I can't guarantee that we have a key for everything. Again, I'm the only one who, as far as I know, was teaching this unit in previous years. I have a partner this year who I think will be helping, who will be also doing that, a teammate at school. So hoping to be able to fill in the gaps where the gaps exist in terms of keys. But this one, I would say it depends on how the students set it up. So this is one of those things where the key might say answers will vary. Like in old textbooks, right? When you opened up the book and it was like, that didn't tell me anything, because they might answer a variety of answers. But we might give a couple of examples that said, if you said it this way, then you should get this result. Other questions? Make sure this is small enough so we can see better. I do like to use the show a portion of the screen part on here, but it doesn't always work perfectly. All right. So as part of the carbon cycle, I mean, you can't learn or teach about the carbon cycle without knowing about how carbon moves, right? And the simulator does a relatively good job about that. But what it doesn't do is give the details about how living things contribute to the carbon cycle, except for the fact that that humans are burning fossil fuels and deforesting at relatively high rates. And so we do have an article that's incorporated for students to get to the idea that forests actually serve as carbon sinks, and that's a good thing. Carbon sinks are not always, it's not always a topic that I don't remember learning about carbon sinks. Maybe in the 80s and 90s, we weren't so worried about it. So this is an article from I think it's from the from OFRI or another Oregon forest organization. And there are just a few questions that are in the INB, or there's also a Go Formative option. That's a relatively quick one. So we did this one. And what I wanted to just talk about a little bit is, the way, and many of you, if you've been doing this job for any amount of time, you know that it's very likely that how we as teachers learn science, or how you as a teacher, when you were a student, when you learned science, was very teacher-centered, sage on the sage sort of thing. But what we want students to be able to do is to interact a little bit more, or frankly, a lot more. We don't want the performance assessment to just be about recall, or frankly, I can't imagine what that would be like as a teacher, to be the deliverer of the information all the time. So what we want students to do is to be able to interact with the material, right? The student, they have their practice skills, right? They know how to graph, they know how to read graphs. They need some assistance occasionally, or maybe not so occasionally, maybe more often than not. But the teacher is setting up the system with the student and the skills so that there's this interaction among the three, right? This triangle sort of setup. And I like the idea about the teacher tuning the environment, right? Making it open enough for students to be able to discover some things on their own, but also to make sure that there's guidance set up in the activity itself, so that the students are getting towards practicing or investigating the questions that we want them to investigate. And I think this is this carbon cycle activity is a good example of this, because it is pretty flexible. You can do it a little bit more guided in your classroom if you want, and there are slides for that. But oftentimes what I'll do is it's broken up into sections, and I might introduce section 1 or part 1, do a little bit of a background about that, and then leave the students to be able to do their own investigation and to fill out their document on their own. And that leaves me free to help students who need help in engaging appropriately and redirecting and monitoring, doing all these things about tuning the environment. Because it's not something that is a scripted, or it can work out, and I think it should, right? That we should be working more, doing these things more often if we can. Now, one of the ways that I like to do that is in the seating arrangement that I use in my class. So I have all my students sitting at tables, and I'm very deliberate about how I choose the table groups. I do let students give me some feedback about how they want, or like a person or people with whom they would like to sit, but I always reserve the right to change them if that pairing doesn't work. But one strategy that I use when I am choosing who's sitting where is that I don't like to put all of my high flyers, for example, at the same table. And so in this diagram, L would be a student who is maybe underperforming, perhaps. M's would be students who are kind of doing right about average, and H would be a high flyer. And you'll notice that in our table of 4, no person is more than kind of one level away from any of the people at their table with whom they might talk regularly, right? We have rectangular tables, so my L and my H are actually the farthest away from each other at the table. And I don't often try to do diagonal talk across the table because it's just too far. So when I have students talk with a shoulder partner, they're talking with a person next to them. And then if they're talking to their across the table partner, they're talking to the person who's facing them. And in this setup, it facilitates the talk because you don't have situations where one person gets ignored or one person is doing all the work, because they're talking to someone always who is in a, all sort of one level away, if we were to make those kind of underperforming, performing at grade level, and performing above grade level, or meeting or exceeding the standard, I guess you could say. So the expectation always is that all the students are engaging in the talk, because they're still high school students and they all have progress to make. They don't all know all the answers. So that's one way that I ask student, make sure or try to ensure that students are engaging in the talk protocols when we have them, and so that they can feel comfortable. All of them can feel comfortable in those conversations. Great. So also part of the carbon cycle, of course, is photosynthesis. And since Unit 5 does not really have any, or does not have any labs that have Desmos, it was really important to me when we were, and the rest of the council, when we were developing this unit, to make sure that we had a mathematical pattern lab, because there isn't one in Unit 5 and there isn't one in Unit 4. The last one we have done in this course is in Unit 3. And so at the time when we were developing this unit, we were not in person in school. We were in Beaverton. We saw all the students every day in first semester, and they took their entire year class of biology in the first semester, because we saw them every day for double the time, or like a block period, but every day. So we developed this patterns lab using a virtual photosynthesis inquiry, which uses open processing. Some of you, if you've been around for a while, may remember that we used open processing for the predator-prey simulation. So it's the same kind of setup. And the person who wrote this code for us was the Oregon Science Teacher of the Year a couple of years ago, Jason Galbraith from Sunset High School. He was the one who represented Oregon to the Math and Science National Teacher of the Year competition, I guess. And so he wrote the code that allows us to investigate photosynthesis in a virtual way. So there's a link to this here, what the students would do, and some slides, of course. And in this lab, the students are assigned a variable, and the 3 variables that are possible to study in this lab are carbon dioxide concentration, the color of light, and I am blanking. Somebody help me out. Where is my, light intensity. I knew that was there. Thank you. Thanks, Doug. So those 3, and so I usually assign my groups. The color of light one is a little bit, it's easier for the data collection, but it is the one that cannot be graphed with Desmos. It has to be graphed with Excel because it's a bar graph. I've toyed with the idea of doing it with the wavelength of light, but haven't figured out how to get that to work without generating the chlorophyll absorption graph, which is a little bit difficult to get your mind around if you're not really sure what it means. But we are right now in the process of, in my team at school, we're going to adapt this year to try and do it with the floating leaf discs. So punching the leaves punching holes out of the leaves, extracting all of the carbon dioxide from the leaf, and then allowing the leaves to float as they produce oxygen gas. So some of you may be familiar with that from having done it in AP or an IB class, or years ago before patterns, I used to do that in as a standard type of photosynthesis inquiry. So we're going to try that in my school this year, and we'll let you know how it works. Make sure that the materials are available for you once we've been able to test it But if you are not familiar with open processing, the way that it works is, of course, this is standard patterns type of stuff where they make sorry, I'm scrolling up and down. I shouldn't do that on your screen. I apologize. They ask a question, and notice here that there's a lot of emptiness here, right? Remember that this is the last lab, or this is, you wouldn't necessarily remember, but this is the last mathematical pattern lab that they will do in their 3-year patterns high school sequence. So whereas in physics and in chemistry, sometimes the wild guess question or the research question, those are written out and scripted out for students on the lab template. Here, it's not. The expectation is that by the end of the junior year, that they're feeling more and more comfortable with the format, and and of course, all the information that they need to type is actually on the slides. So it's not far away for them, but we're putting more responsibility on them. Releasing the locus of control, right? Making students have more and more responsibility as they are getting more proficient and older, frankly. So then there's a section where we've provided them some guidance about what to write in a background paragraph and some sentence framing there. I always try to push why it's really important to cite their sources. So I always like to keep that in there and remind them for their citations. And then, of course, a hypothesis section, and null hypothesis is something that we introduce in biodiversity in Unit 1. And it's a good step up from the previous coursework where they're not talking about a null hypothesis. And it's always a great way to discuss with students that scientists don't always know, right, what they're going to get. And so it's good for them to predict a null hypothesis in case that happens to be what they get, but in case that happens to be their end result. And so then there's a guidance here about how to use the simulation. They copy the code and they paste the code into open processing. We don't have time to do that here today, but there's a picture that shows up and it shows a piece of Elodia and it shows little bubbles coming up off the Elodia. So it's a simple animation or simulation. The data collection is the fastest, super fast. They can do 3 or 4 trials in like 10 minutes if they're paying attention to what they're doing. And so this ends up being a shorter lab than some other patterns labs because the data collection is done with the simulator and it's very, very quick. And so they get, they find out that colorless light is the most effective, and they find out that that light intensities helps build. And so that does go relatively quickly, but it allows you to get in that photosynthesis standard, which doesn't really fit when we do biodiversity in the fall. So it's this ecology related standard and carbon cycle, or connected to the carbon cycle, doesn't fit where we hit ecology earlier in the year. Yeah, Jason says that there's a Vernier colorimeters or CO2 and O2 sensors. If you have those in your building, there's an AP lab that uses that. And that might be something also that we could consider like writing up as an alternative for people who have that equipment. I love this virtual one is great if you have students who are gone. Also, it's an easy one to be able to say, you have an internet enabled device, you can do this task. Good question, Jeff. I have never done the bubble counting with anything other than Elodia. And in Forest Grove, we used to actually go out to the creek and collect it. So that's, a long time ago. We used to do it. I used to do an old one where we would put a snail and Elodia in a closed system together and see how long they would live. But I don't know. Has anybody ever tried something like this with something other than Elodia, some other kind of aquatic, like aquarium plant that you can see the bubbles for? Yeah, I don't know. That's why we were thinking Gosh, Amazon will send Elodia to Oregon?
Yeah, I was just gonna put that in the chat also.
Whoa, that's surprising. That's what I thought. Elodia is banned in Oregon because it's invasive. That's interesting. Huh. What did you do with it, Elizabeth?
We just used it to look at like cytoplasmic streaming under
Yeah.
the microscope. But yeah, they delivered. I was surprised myself, but they delivered it. It was cool.
Okay, so Mel says that at the pet store, they'll sell you an Oregon safe plant.
Yeah. There's like one species that is the invasive one and one that they can send around.
Yeah, so maybe they're sending, maybe it's a different species, Elizabeth, that you got than the one that we used to collect. Okay, cool. So close relative to Elodia, 2 layers thick. Yeah, from the aquarium store. Yeah, and Erica, I see your message too. Like that's what we used to do in Forest Grove. We used to collect it from the creek. So maybe a couple options there, Jeff. Lenora, if you find out what the close relative is, could you let me know and I can pass the information on to Jeff? Perfect, thank you. So one of the things I wanted to point out about this lab is that, so it is a jigsaw. And so each group is testing something a little bit different. So some are doing light intensity, some are doing CO2 concentration, and others are doing light, color of light. You can run it with the regular Desmos template, which is represented here, or you can use Teacher Desmos. I know some of you came to the Desmos in Biology webinar that Bradford and I did a couple of months back. And then Jason put a picture in here. If you're not familiar with the floating leaf discs lab, this is a good little animation of how that actually works. That when you pull all the carbon dioxide out of the leaf discs, they sink because they're denser than the liquid. And the liquid has some sodium bicarbonate in it as a source of carbon dioxide. And as those leaves take in the carbon dioxide and produce oxygen gas, they actually start to float because they're expelling water out of the leaves. So they become less dense and they rise. So it looks like we got a couple of things potentially in the works for alternatives to the virtual option. But for right now, we got the virtual thing in there. If you're not familiar with Teacher Desmos, I encourage you to watch the recording of the using Desmos in Biology that Bradford and I did a couple of months ago. I love it. It allows you to see all the student graphs on your teacher screen at the same time, so you can actually see who's doing what they're supposed to be doing and figure out who is most likely to be copying their graph from their friend rather than making it themselves. Jason is a master with Teacher Desmos. He does a lot of other things in Teacher Desmos, but I love it for, especially in COVID, it was great. Okay, so
It also changed names, did it not? Teacher Desmos is now something else.
now it's called Desmos Classroom, I think. Yeah.
But if you look up Teacher Desmos, it still comes up.
Yeah, it'll send you to the right thing. So I'm just curious, on the Jamboard, I'm going to pull, I still have my Jamboard link. Nope, I don't. Let me get the Jamboard link again. You might still have the Jamboard open. I'm curious your thoughts just for a minute or two here, just a little reflection at the very end of this Jamboard. Oh, that is not the right. Sorry, that link was wrong. There we go. Jason put it in. At the end of the Jamboard, I've just asked if you can reflect on one of these questions. There are 4 questions. Some of you have experienced this patterns approach to inquiry as a teacher already. And I'm curious to know if you have thoughts about what differences do you see in student experience pre-patterns inquiry and post-patterns inquiry, like what shifts have you noticed? If you're going to answer that question, you're going to put it in a yellow sticky. If you would prefer, you can ask the question or answer the question, how does this approach allow students to leverage their own knowledge while they're collaborating? That could be on a green sticky. And then on the next two, or the next panel are the other two questions. When we're teaching using inquiry, what are the trade-offs? And we certainly have to consider, still coming out of the pandemic, there are still definitely trade-offs. What are the trade-offs that we have to consider? And then lastly, why do we need to make these experiences worth it for our students and for our teaching? So you don't have to answer more than one, maybe just pick one of those, find the spot on the Jamboard in panels 5 and 6 where that question is, and take a couple of minutes to write us the response on a colored sticky. Curiosity, accountability. They're collecting the data themselves. Yeah, they learn to rely on themselves. I think that's a big piece. They feel that they have the ability to go further if they want. Shift over to the other one. Yeah, pushing for independent thinking, I think, is a reason we need to make it worth it. Good kids are more likely to buy in. They'll remember doing science, yes. Trade-offs. All right, Doug, I'm going to grab your thing here and add it in. It's over. Right. Yeah, it can be difficult to teach curiosity. That's definitely a challenge. Yeah, setup time. I think we also sacrifice a fair bit of class time, right? You can't get through as much as you used to get through if you're really going to engage in the inquiry options. Yeah, it takes longer, harder to monitor the progress. You have to be very intentional about inserting interventions when they're needed. Yes, much agreed. Yeah, I agree. I don't know who it is who wrote about the possibly getting too deep into a misconception before the teacher catches it. So that's one reason I think that it's really essential to be that rover, right? Not being up at the desk, especially when any of this is happening. I'm teaching chemistry this year and we're doing chemical reactions right now. Definitely came across a fair number of misconceptions, misunderstandings about what was actually happening in the experiments when the students were doing them. Yeah, great. I'm just going to flip back over. Feel free to I'll stop talking for a minute or so. Everybody has an opportunity to read the others' thoughts.
I think it's also way more difficult to get a kid caught up if they're gone for a long period of time with this inquiry stuff. Mine would go in orange.
Yeah, definitely a trade-off. Brian, I'm just seeing your note in the chat. Susan Holbeck is the person you need to reach out to. She's still on the call, so you can send her a message.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, your chat is appearing as Susan Hovick, so I don't.
That's interesting because I'm definitely not listed as, huh. But I'm definitely showing up as myself, so. So Brian, let me know if you don't hear back from her because we're on the same account, so that's probably why there's a confusion. But if you don't hear back from her, then we can get you in touch.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think that what we're noticing here is that there are some drawbacks, but overwhelmingly what I see here are positives around making sure that we're using the inquiry approach that is been designed in the patterns curriculum. And one thing that I think is just so amazing is that not everybody is always not every student in the class is doing the same thing. So the idea that they have to learn from each other to get the whole picture, I think is really powerful. It helps them learn the values of collaboration and sharing during a time period of their life where they're really not built to do that very often, says someone who has teenagers at home also. So I do see a lot of power in it, and it seems like you do too. All right, it's about a little after 5. So we have a couple more tasks to go through before we hit our time limit. So I wanted to acknowledge some of you have been around long enough to know that to remember the algae engineering project. So I know, especially if you took the summer class before COVID, we engaged in this project in the summer class. And, obviously during at-home learning, doing the algae engineering was not possible. And we had to shift the unit phenomenon in this unit in order to be able to accommodate a virtual option or virtual experience. And at the same time, we are also across the state implementing tribal history, shared history lessons. And so the unit doesn't really accommodate the algae engineering idea anymore. We're trying to figure out a way how to get algae back into the curriculum. I know a lot of you have the materials for growing the algae and doing a project related to algae. Just know that it's on our minds. And if you teach IB ESS or like an AP environmental science or maybe an environmental science elective, I will happily send you all of the materials, like all of the student materials, if you want to do the algae project. I mean the digital materials, not talking about physical materials. You can do it but if you wanted to borrow physical materials from me, I'd happily get those over to you, at least on a temporary basis, until we can get a way to get it back into the curriculum. So I just wanted to put that out there if any of you are interested. Now, one of the standards that fits into this unit is coevolution. It's an ESS standard about the coevolution of Earth systems and life. And one year, so the year that we were in hybrid, I did not have time to teach this, but I did teach it last year. It's a standalone lesson. It's like it's 1 90-minute period. If you have time for it, it's great. It's an HHMI lesson, so it's in depth. And it's about the geological history of oxygen. So it's a graph reading exercise. So if you were to need to be out, need to leave a biology lesson with a substitute, this is actually one that students are able to do on their own, because it's all about reading the graph and all the information is there. But we'll not spend time on this today. It is not, I would say, if you have to cut something in this unit, this would probably be it. It does only cut about a day, but it allows you to potentially, if you need to, have a buffer day for some of the other larger projects. Here's another picture from that. And then we have there's a writing task that can be used or not, depending on time, where they're constructing an argument that algae has played a critical role because it's, of course, this peak or this increase in oxygen in the atmosphere is when around the same time when algae evolved. Okay, any questions on that before we go on into the tribal history, shared history lesson? All right. Okay, so 6.4, we just got 2 more to go. 6.4 is the tribal history, shared history lesson. That is one of 3 lessons of this type that is incorporated into patterns biology. There is one in unit 1 and another one in unit 4. There's also the 4th one is in patterns chemistry unit 4. And so this lesson was developed between the 9 tribes of Oregon and Oregon Department of Education. You may have had some professional development about this because the rollout has been, I was talking actually with Jason about this relatively recently, that seems like districts are not all on the same page about when the rollout was supposed to happen or is happening. In Beaverton, it's been the expectation that we've been teaching tribal history, shared history lessons since the year that we were home, teaching online for COVID. So, but maybe not all districts have made that decision, but that's been my experience. So this will be the 3rd full year where we will have been implementing all the tribal history, shared history lessons in science. If you are unfamiliar with this program, I've provided some links here. We will not have time to look at all of them, certainly, but these are things that any teacher teaching about tribal history, especially people like me who do not identify as Indigenous, things that people need to know before teaching these lessons, understandings about Native Americans in Oregon and approaches to Indigenous education. It would be some good summer reading to get yourself up to speed about this plan, about this law. We used to be called SB 13 before it was passed into law. So in this unit, or in unit 6, the lesson is about how Oregon's tribes manage their land. And this was kind of the impetus when we learned that we needed to implement this lesson. This led us toward the idea of fire ecology for the final project in this unit. So the lesson came from, as I said, from the tribes and from ODE, and there are limitations to, I shouldn't say limitations. We are not to change or to remove content from the original lesson. But what we have done is that we have done some additions to the lesson to help use the content of the original lesson to work within the context of this unit in biology. So there are several parts. There are some slides and videos for students to use to hear of Native people who tell their stories about the arrival of settlers here, how resources were extracted from the land, how treaties were made and then broken almost immediately, and how ecosystems are being restored by tribes. And then there's a fair bit of the lesson that works to compare and contrast what's called traditional Indigenous or traditional Native knowledge with the idea of Western science. So for me, that part was particularly interesting. So there's a large Venn diagram that the students are able to use for that. And then the active part, or the more active part for students, is that they investigate. There are 4 case studies that come from tribes or confederations across the state, where students are working in groups to read about the things that the tribes are doing to manage their land in their area. And so I would imagine if your school or your district is near one of these, you can highlight that one, maybe use it as an example, divide the others among the class as as additional ones to research. Find additional things. I was able to find last year some information about about Coquille tribe and the Southern Coast, where they did a land swap. They had they had had a part of their land that had been taken away, that they were able to recover through the use of some land grants, and then they were able to raise funds and get I think it's an unlimited year lease, or they've gotten the land back. Sorry, I don't have those details straight in my head. In our materials, these case studies are set up in a group by group jigsaw, so that not every student is required to read every case study. It allows the students, again, to divide the work into manageable parts, but then yet to still have an opportunity to learn about all of the different things that are happening. And they identify what the goals of the project are, impact on the tribes, and the partnerships that the tribes are using that are outside of their groups. So some of these are individual tribes, others, like you can see, the Intertribal Fish Commission, and then the confederations at Siletz and Grand Ronde. And I think, let me just look at these slides here. Oh, that's the wrong one. To look at this one to see if there's anything else that I missed. Yes, Laura, that's a good question. So this first part, which is a little bit more sit and get that I prefer, that's about an hour and a half, because they're like 4 or 5 videos. And then we added, and that's actually what I just wanted to look at here. We added a fair bit of history. So what we see here, for example, is this is a animation that shows the pieces of, let me just turn off I don't think there's any audio here, but I'll talk while it's running in the background. It shows a map that indicates the parts of this continent that were inhabited by indigenous peoples starting in 1783. And then year by year, based on treaty documents, it shows how the geography changed in terms of who was inhabiting that area and who was claiming that area. So what we have done to add to this lesson to kind of fill it out is to provide a little bit more of that background and history. I did not personally know a lot of this history. I grew up on the East Coast in a place where the indigenous populations had been gone for significantly longer, because those were the areas that were colonized first. And my knowledge in this area for my own education was almost zero. So I learned a lot in the developing of these materials because I didn't know anything really. So this is an example of something that we added, was this animation. What we did is that we put anything that has a blue background is something that we added. Anything that has a white background is something that was originally in the lesson. So there's a fair bit that we've added for context. We also added, like, for example, here we have just the transcript of what's being said, because the closed captions on the videos don't work. So the first section, if I go back to my slides, this first section where students are listening to the voices and learning about the history part, that's about 1 hour and a half. And then this part where they do the studies of the projects, that's another 1.5 hours. If you can figure out a way to get that all across in less time, would love to, or in a more interactive way, I would love to hear about it. Especially this first part. Any other questions about that one? Okay, and then that gets us to the meat. So in my school, this last task is the culminating task of the year. We usually end up with like 1 class period left where students might be able to do to recover or use to recover a score from previous in the semester, like 1 last retake opportunity or so-called final exam opportunity. But this last task, 6.5, can be done, I'd say, in probably 3 days, but I like to stretch it out to 4 days to give students really the opportunity to do the research that it really calls for. So what we're trying to get across in this lesson is that there are management practices that have happened to manage our forests over the last couple of 100 years. And to ask the question, are these management practices that we're using currently to manage our forests, are they the best ones that we should be using in light of the fact that we're dealing with wildfire, like significant wildfire now on the regular? And is there a better way potentially to do things? So the students do a fair bit of research independently with guided resources that come in the materials, sources that have been vetted in advance by people who on the Biology Council who worked on this. And then students' job at the end, their end product is an argumentative essay, but you could just as easily have them do a presentation or some other assessment of your choice. But this is all the materials are set up for an argumentative essay, which fits because they also work on argumentative writing in their ELA class. And so we start out with some history and data about forests, right? And how tribe and government land ownership has worked, and then also about wildfires. And so you will see this kind of goes back, of course, to the images and data that we presented in the initial lesson, which in this case, because this unit is so short, is only probably 2 weeks before. So it's still pretty fresh in their minds. And they then have jigsawed readings and they share their work with others. So one thing I wanted to point out here is this wildfire timeline, which is really cool. And this is actually a wildfire management timeline. So when we first did this with the COVID year, this timeline was available online. And then you may remember that Flash died in the middle of the year. And literally, like right before I was going to teach this series of lessons is when Flash went away. And so this interactive timeline about forest management, and you can see it goes across, and then it also goes down, and we have different locations and different things that are happening. You can click on the thing, it will tell you, show you the picture. Here's a fire tower, for example. And I wrote to the National Park Service and I said, I need this for a lesson. We have built our whole lesson around the existence of this timeline. And can you put it back? Like, is there something you can do? And they said, well, sorry, it's Flash-based and no, we can't, but here's a PDF. And I was like, oh, okay, well, PDF is, I guess it's better than nothing. It has the main stuff on it, but it was not nearly as good. And even this one, I think, is not as good as the original. But then they wrote me back like 8 months later and said, hey, just wanted to let you know that we put back an interactive timeline back on the website. So, I thought that was actually pretty cool that I reached out to National Park Service. They said, sorry, we can't help you now. But then they wrote me back when it actually was working again. So I thought that was neat. Let's see, how do I have this set up? Yeah, this is one where I think you should probably helpful to look at the student template. Let me put this into the chat for you. So you can see what that actually looks like. I mean, I feel like there are new stories. I listen to the radio in the morning and when I'm getting ready for work, and I feel like, every week there's something new about wildfire or something new about even what was it last week? It was about how the glacial melting and the difference in convection happening in the oceans is shifting the jet stream. Right, all about and fire was part of that conversation that the journalist was having with the experts. So we try to keep the resources that are in this document up to date, but it's hard to keep up, to be frank. It's a little bit difficult to make sure that we're getting all the best materials, all the best articles and podcasts and things like that in the materials for students. So if you hear something or see something or have a link to something that you think should be included as a resource for students, please send it along, because we can add those things. The more resources that we're providing to students, the better they are, or the better the materials are. So this is set up as an evaluation problem evaluation project, where we are asking students to evaluate current forest management practices and to either propose that we keep the forest management practices that are currently in place, or to propose an alternative to those forest management practices. And so it's set up as an engineering project, right, with the request for proposal, or in this case, request for evaluation, where we're asking students to do those things in order to mitigate effects of climate change, reducing overall effects of wildfire on forest ecosystems. And we're specifically calling out that we want students to inform their view with historical and current traditional ecological knowledge that is practiced by our local tribes and has been practiced by them since time immemorial. So we start out with some clips from a series that's called Tending the Wild, and I want to show you at least one of these clips so that you can see. I have 3 of them in the slideshow. We'll see. I think I should be able to get to be able to watch 2 of them, but I want you to see what the students are seeing in this particular case. Let me fix my sharing here again. Here's our first clip. This came from, I think, KQED in San Francisco. It is, a lot of this was taken in Northern California. Okay, let me pause. Let me make sure I have my sharing set up properly for sharing audio. Let me start again. There we go. Tell me if this is better.
You have to know how to work with fire. When you're my age, I take my young ones out, smell the smoke, smell it. That's grass fire. Smell the smoke, that's a house burning. Smell the smoke, that's tires burning. That's a wood fireplace burning. You should be able to smell every single different kind of smoke. The animals teach their young to do that. But if there's no fire, they can't teach them to do that. That's why we have to burn. That's why we have to keep the fires going, so that all parts of life understand what it is that we're doing with fire. The North Fork Mono and most of the other Mono groups have been here for 15,000 years. When the Indian was out on the land, they always burned. So the use of fire comes through your land so that it can take care of your resources and give you new ones. Cultural burning is exactly that. So when we burn, we are burning to perfect this resource to supply resources for our culture, rather it be food, medicine, fiber, sticks, basketry material.
Didn't you guys just burn it?
It's been a few years. We've burned like, I don't know, 50 yards in all directions. And so this was part of like a little plot we had burned here.
So these are new shoots right here coming up. It's good to see this. We'll have the berries to eat. If you eat them red and dry with salt,
In this particular area, this is where we've been burning for the past 5-6 years. We've applied fire here a couple of times. This is the Mariposa gray leaf manzanita. This is a medicine, both food and medicine. The berry could be, once it's fermented, a really good drink for your stomach. One of the things that we've done here is we burned underneath this and pruned this bush up, trimmed it up so that, one, it will have these nice big bunches of berries. And then on the stalk here, the bark is peeling. This bark is used for poison oak. When you're burning, you try to get the wind to go in the direction of the resource that you want to apply smoke to. Smoke helps the leaves and the berries to become a better product. Consequently, there's been new growth. That's all a part of the end result of applying fire and smoke to the resource. We were burning an area that hadn't been burned for well over 120 years. And when we did burn, these bushes that we're standing in the middle of that are basically 3 foot tall were about 5 or 6 feet tall, and so thick you could not walk through them. So dry that lichen and California dodder, which is a parasite, was beginning to crawl all over them and kill them. So it needed fire. This land needed fire. You need to be able to see through the trees. The concept that we are bringing forth when we work out on the land is this open concept. We've got to be able to see through. When the baby is inside of the basket, look through the basket. See the world. See through the basket to the outer world. See through the forest. See through from this world to the next world. Always the ability to see through.
Okay, so that's the first clip. Sorry for my mistake on my first sharing. I had not shared properly, so glad I asked. And this is I think I mentioned it's from KQED or another public television station in California. And it's a series. If you're not familiar with this series, Tending the Wild, it's all available on YouTube. There are multiple hour-long episodes. And of course, this is, a clip clearly about fire. So super relevant in our situation here. So I actually have longer pieces that we show to students. I wanted to pull the most essential pieces that are relevant for us. So here's our second one.
Fire is really a lot like electricity. Electricity is a dangerous thing. You can get a severe shock from electricity and it can kill people, but it can also be put to wonderful uses. And fire, when used in a sophisticated manner, is very much the same way. Fire can course through the forest like electrons through a wire and energize those circuits that the forest has. It can turn on the meadows and encourage them to bloom at the right time of the year.
Fire is a spirit. This land has spirits. And when we're burning, they come alive. And those spirits, they still hear. That's why we do sing to them. That's why we do talk to them. You have to understand fire. You have to respect fire. You can't be afraid of it. If you're afraid of fire, you won't understand fire.
The Spaniards wanted to suppress fire because they saw it as dangerous and did not necessarily understand what purposes people were putting the fire to. They saw it as a careless application of fire by what many of them referred to as, quote, primitive people, unquote. So fire suppression is very much tied up with social and political oppression of Native American people. It might sound like a good thing to have a lot of trees. That's what the Forest Service thought. And they wanted to maximize the number of trees per acre. But what they were doing was changing the landscape, getting lots of little thin trees in between the bigger trees and the wide spacings that had been maintained for thousands of years by indigenous fires. By suppressing fire and keeping people from lighting cultural burns, you built up the fuel over time. And that's what has led to a situation today where the forest is full of trees, but really closely packed and ready for that spark and for a huge wildfire to start at any time.
Oh, sorry, he got cut off there, but wildfire to start at any time. So that guy works now with the tribes, but was a ranger for the Forest Service. So I think he does a great job of showing, well, guess what? We started to suppress fire because the people who showed up here, even though others had been living here for thousands and thousands of years or since time immemorial, someone else made the decision that forest should be managed in a certain way. I want to, I have another clip, but I want to talk about a couple other things first. The last one's only about 3 minutes, so if we have time, we'll come back to it. So the last design principle that I wanted to discuss today has to do with being culturally responsive. And you all know that we have 3D learning, right, with the SCPs and the cross-cutting concepts and the disciplinary core ideas. But when we add interest and identity to these, and I'm sorry, I don't have the, I thought I had the notes of the author of this book in my, or the author of this idea in my notes, but I don't have that. I'll have to get that to you. But if you add interest and identity to those three dimensions of the NGSS, you get what people are calling 5D learning. And so when we consider culturally responsive teaching, when we talk about the way that we're trying to incorporate culturally responsive teaching into the patterns curriculum, that has to do with valuing student capital, right? Making sure that we're choosing place-based phenomena, right? Sharing with students. That's why we have in chemistry, for example, the Oregon Capitol building, or the fact that we do the biodiversity lab in our own backyard and not learn about some other scenario where there was a, trophic cascade. Talking about environmental and social justice, right? Making sure that we have opportunities for students to address things like the fact that race is not biological, right? Those kinds of questions are all parts of the culturally responsive components of patterns curriculum. And of course, doing career connections. I know a lot of you have done the externships over the years with PMSP. So this lesson or series of lessons is part of the culturally responsive components, right? One of the lessons that's really particularly has that at the forefront. So if we go back here to the student task, that video that we just watched 2 clips of is this cultural burning video. And so asking students or prompting students to take some notes on what tribal forest management practices are versus the Forest Service or US government practices. I think that both of those were observed just in those 2 short clips that we watched. And then having them try to think about what are the impacts of those different kinds of practices on ecosystems and on the human beings living in or near those ecosystems, right? Just to get students starting to think about how has What are the basics about how land has been managed, especially in the Western US since the arrival, or since colonization, a couple hundred years or so, and how is that different from what was done in the time before, and then what have the impacts been? This, of course, harkens back to the previous lesson from tribal history, shared history, where students learned about the differences between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. So there's a connection there. There's a reason we put those two right together. Then you'll see that we have one or two options. We give students, excuse me, several options, like 10 or so options for articles, videos, and podcasts for students to read or listen to. And then they have a little notes table here down below. We're just asking each student to read 2 of them or listen to 2. There are also some additional ones in the slide notes that it was easier for me to add those in the slide notes. I'll make sure they get added in this template also. And so then after each student reads their 2 and they get to pick which 2 they want to do, they take their notes and they put them into a shared slideshow so that even if each student doesn't read every piece, they have access to, salient information from each piece. And as a result of that, if they read about something that they want from notes from another student, and then they want to go deeper into that, they can go into that resource and look at it themselves, but they don't have to read the whole entirety of every single resource that we have provided. It allows them as sort of an insight, kind of a window into what the other resources contain.
Charlotte, could you explain that again real quick? So you said, so they're sharing a document, you said? I'm wondering.
Sure, I'll show you. I linked it an example, I think. I had that in here. So let me pull it. Jason, could you actually pull that? This template should be in the Unit 6 open access under 6.5. Sorry, Secret, I thought I had it linked here, but I don't see it. Hopefully Jason will be able to find that. If we can't, then if he can't find it in the next minute, I'll go looking for it. I'll share with you. Yeah, sorry. I'll just repeat what I said. So there are about 10 or so resources here. And I think that what I've done in the past, I haven't looked at this super closely what I did last year, but I think what I did is that I asked each student to choose 2, and I had them sign up so that not every student was reading the same 2 pieces. And then what they did is that they took their notes on this document, because this is each student has this document. They take their own notes, both on what the management practices are that are described in their piece, and then the impacts on the ecosystems and humans. So notice that the prompts there are very similar to what we saw earlier. So here, the prompts are very similar, but that's coming from the video that we all watched together. So they're kind of getting prepped when watching the video, and we talk about these bits so that they have something written here before they go and choose their articles, so that they know what kind of information they're looking for in the articles when they're writing their notes here down below. And then there is I think it's a slideshow or a Jamboard, Jason. It should be under 6.5, something like data sharing template or something like that. That would be the name of it. Okay, good. Jason thinks he found it. Perfect. Yep, this is it. So you, as a teacher, would make a copy of this slideshow for every class. All of the articles are linked here, same ones that are in the student template. And then what I ask students to do is, if they are, picking a particular source, like this source, Indian use of fire in early Oregon, I ask them to write their name here even before they read it so that I know who is reading what. And I'm also then sure that I have enough students reading each piece so that we're likely to get some good notes out of them and present on this shared note-taking document. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That visual is really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think I changed this last year in order to be able to say, okay, for me to have a visual to say, oh yeah, Johnny and Jacob and Charlene are all going to be reading this source. And it also then lets me know, well, Johnny and Jacob are doing okay, but Charlene seems to be not really getting the point. I need to go talk to Charlene. So it also, again, helps out when, if a kid's absent, like there's a resource that they can go back to. And so those two things together, like watching that video and then doing this research part, that probably takes one class period. But it sets them up for some basics behind their arguments that they're going to be using in their paper that they're going to write or their presentation that they're going to do. Then the second part is about, actually, I should say, sorry, with the 90 minutes is with this historical shifts part. And this is where we have the timeline that I showed you before. So we have the interactive timeline and then the PDF. There's a PDF version. I figured I would put both of them in there in case the interactive one goes away again. And then these are two documents that I actually print out. One of them is from the Forest Service, wildfire management in the Forest Service, a history, and then this other document called the Evolution and History of Wildland Fire Use. And I ask students to look at one or more of these, and then they're taking their own notes here. So we're start as a class, then they work sort of in some small groups, and now in this section, they're responsible for doing a little bit of their own. Now I have a document that I've kind of created over time where I've figured out what are the main points from each of these sources, so that if I have a student who's really struggling, I can go to them and say, okay, let's see, here's what I found when I read this source. Let's see if we can find this information, and then kind of help guide them through that independent part of the research. And those things, those first two parts altogether, so part one and part two, they're basically collecting all of the information that they should need in order to do their essay, right? So we have this last couple, sorry, I think I said parts 1 and 2. I meant 1 through 3. This is a podcast that they can listen to. They can read the article or listen to the podcast. This is where we have, this is a specific situation in Oregon where the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Indians. This is a long article, but there is a very relevant quote here that basically shows that the federal government has stepped into the fire management space, but over and over it's been shown that they've actually not done what they said they were going to do. Supposedly to serve as a model for resource management, but that the tribal land management practices actually have a lot better results. So the students have access to argumentation, information about how Indigenous burning can actually help prevent wildfire and what the track record of the current management practices has been. Right, and then the last part here, because I'm going to wrap up, I want to make sure we have time for questions. This is where they're writing their argumentative essay. So the last, I'd say, I've done it a couple of different ways. I'd say, I think I probably gave them last year maybe 2 class periods of time to write. What I want to do this year is I want to talk to my colleagues in English language arts and ask them, when the students are writing an essay, what kind of class time do they provide and what kind of supports do they provide their students if they're writing an essay about a book, for example. So that's something that I want to investigate a little bit more to make sure that we're being reasonable about the timing that we're providing. That's not something I've done before. There is a resource sheet for argumentative writing, which is linked here for students to be able to use. It's color coded very similarly to our conclusion resources, because really the students in an argumentative piece, what are they actually doing? Well, they're basically writing a CER, right? Making a claim, providing evidence and reasoning from the resources that they've collected. But then what we add here is the idea of a counterclaim and rebuttal. Because in order to be able to understand your own argument as best as you can, you should really know what the counter argument is. And so students write about at least one counter argument and then rebut that counter argument with their best pieces of information. And then they conclude. I'd say that the first time I did this 2 years ago during COVID, I was a little bit nervous about asking students to write a whole essay. But I was very pleasantly surprised as to what they were able to come up with. And so I wanted to provide you or to show you what some examples might look like. Oops. So I've linked for you sort of a high level response and a medium level response. And I don't know about you guys, but I like it when they color code their essay because it helps me to see, are they actually getting what they think, what I think they should be getting? And are they recognizing what parts of their research are actually evidence and what's actually then the explanation of that evidence? So this is just a screenshot of these. I wouldn't try to read that here, but I would encourage you to take a look at the kinds of things that students are able to generate with the materials. Okay, I'm going to open it up for some questions.
I have a question, Charlotte.
Yeah, Laura, hi.
Hi, so I'm thinking about, I have little time to do this unit. It's going to be right up until the end of the year.
Yep.
I'm thinking of final during the 2-hour finals period. Could you see shortening this to like just a claim, evidence, reasoning, and just
Sure.
having them do a little research and write it right there?
Yep. I have done it before. The first year we did this, this was the final opportunity. Like this was the summative.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I felt that it brought in so many different kinds of things. And I think this high example that I've shown you, like that student even brought in like ideas from biodiversity from the beginning of the year. So not every kid's going to be able to do that, but I do think that there's a fair bit of, not molecular stuff, obviously, but there are a lot of things that are related to the themes that we've been addressing all year long that can be wrapped up into this project. I mean, you have to figure out your timing, but you can absolutely pull out like the extra bit of counterclaim rebuttal part that's going to shorten it a fair bit. I'd encourage you to talk to your ELA people to see what are they, what are their expectations and like timing wise. That's my plan for this year, is to talk to the 11th grade ELA teachers to see what they think is reasonable based on when their kids are writing about literature or doing a research paper or something like that. But I hear you on the being cut short, or I mean, short time wise. Other things? Okay, then just quickly here, just a piece of information for you about like the different kinds of evidence that you can collect in this unit. Several things can be addressed for multiple standards. So if you're in a grading system that's addressing by standard, you can collect one piece of evidence and actually get multiple standards from it. I also wanted to put out here that the docs version of the INB, which I think I already showed you, I keep an INB myself, right? So I'm linking my INB to you. It's not completely filled in because I haven't taught it yet this year, but just as an FYI for you, if you're using Canvas and you want to use the look at our Canvas shell, Jesse Chamberlain and I made this during COVID. So I wouldn't say it's 100% up to date, but it might be a good place for you to start if you want to see what other people are doing with Canvas. One thing, please, for the RAP grant that is paying all of you, one of the requirements is that we have been asked to have you fill out an exit ticket form. I'm going to put the code into the chat here. We did make some changes to this webinar based on feedback that we got in the Unit 5 webinar. So we are reading the feedback. We would love to hear back from you. And we have to at least offer the survey to you as a requirement of the RAP grant. So you'll see that there are some questions on there that are required for you to answer, things that like sort of how many students do you teach and what's the scope of patterns biology in your classroom and that kind of thing. But a lot of the feedback questions for us are, we've left those optional. So if you have no feedback in certain areas, you're welcome to leave some of those blank, but we would love to hear what you have to say about how helpful today was or not helpful, or what you'd like to see coming forward, etc. So once you're done with that, you're welcome to go. I'll hang around for a couple minutes in case anybody has questions or still needs to deal with some administrative things. And otherwise, thanks you guys. And I hope it's still light here. I'm hoping to go out for a walk.
Thank
For
you
some
so
reason-
much.
For some reason, when I click that link, it just takes me to a evaluating force management practices template. So I
Oh,
don't.
well, maybe, you know what? Maybe, you know what happened is that looks like I put the wrong link in the chat. Try that one.
Okay, let me go back.
Oh, and you know what? That's going to give you the edit version. Oh, no, that should be,
Nope,
that should
that's
work.
the one. Okay,
Okay,
thank
good.
you.
Sorry. Yeah.
No worries.
Like Google Docs links, you can't really tell what's
Yeah,
what.
oh, definitely.